has been read. Now, what I'm going to read now is is not really a banned book. Oh, and this doesn't have any sex in it. Sorry. It's not a banned book. It's banned ideas. Okay. Have you ever heard of the syllabus of errors of Pope Pius X? Oh, so many of you. This was a core curriculum reading when I was in college. And what it is, it's a catalog of ideas declared anathema by Pope Pius X sometime in the 1860s. Okay? And what that means is that if you're a Catholic and you want to keep it that way, you don't read these ideas, you don't study these ideas, and you certainly don't write or publish these ideas. So anyway, I first encountered this when I was in college, and we read these banned ideas, these anathemas, and it may seem like a strange a choice for a core curriculum, but the effect that it had on me and on my classmates is that once we realized that these are ideas that we had been reading about in other books, it made them that much more interesting and appealing. Okay, so this is the syllabus of errors of Pope Pius the Ninth. I'm sorry, I've been saying the 10th. And he's got them arranged by category. So these are under theology. So remember, this is the forbidden idea. There exists no supreme, all-wise, all-provident, divine being distinct from the universe. And God is identical with the nature of things and is therefore subject to changes. In effect, God is produced in man and in the world, and all things are God and have the very substance of God, and God is one and the same thing with the world, and therefore spirit with matter, necessity with liberty, good with evil, justice with injustice. This is, it's sort of pantheism, the idea that God is everywhere. Also under theology, all action of God upon man in the world is to be denied, forbidden. Human reason, without any reference whatsoever to God, is the sole arbiter of truth and falsehood, and of good and evil. It is law to itself and suffices by its natural force to secure the welfare of men and of nations. I haven't rehearsed this, by the way. Oh, yes.
Give us one or two more.
Okay. Every man is free to embrace and profess the religion which, guided by the light of reason, he shall consider true. Okay, that's forbidden. Let's see. Protestantism is nothing more than another form of the same true Christian religion, in which form it is given to please God equally as in the Catholic Church. Anathema. Let's see. The state, as being the origin and source of all rights, is endowed with a certain right not circumscribed by any limits. Well, yeah, but that's Aristotle, really. Okay, one more?
One more.
Okay. Right consists in the material fact. All human duties are an empty word, and all human facts have the force of right. Okay, I'll stop there.
All right.
Okay, this is year 501 by Noam Chomsky, and this is currently, according to some internet source, that being indomitable, is currently banned by all members for possession by all members of the South Korean military. That's South Korean, not North Korean. You're not allowed to have this book if you are South Korean military. So the good doctor says, the freedom that counts. Among global planners, few captured the essence of policy more clearly than George Kennan when he advised in 1948 that if we are to maintain the disparity between our wealth and the poverty of others, we must put aside idealistic slogans and keep to straight power concepts. Deviation from these guidelines is rare. Such ideals as democracy and the market are well and good, as long as the tilt of the playing field guarantees that the rightful win. If the rascal multitude try to raise their heads, they must be beaten into submission in one way or another in the third world, which we now use, developing nation. Outright violence often suffices. If market forces interfere with domestic privilege, free trade is quickly cast to the flames. These doctrines are too deeply rooted in institutional structures to be seriously challenged within the ruling state-corporate nexus. It can, on occasion, produce someone who will deliver moral lessons on human rights. But when some real interest is at stake, the rhetoric is quickly shelved. Say, when it is necessary to support virtual genocide in Timor, to protect Somoza's National Guard while it is slaughtering thousands of civilians, or to tilt towards China and Pol Pot, to select a few examples from the period of an unusual deviation from the high principle. The consistent practice is illustrated over a broad range throughout this discussion and in sources cited. To select another case that brings out fundamental principles sharply, consider the response when General Chun's military dictatorship in South Korea crushed the democracy movement in Gwangju in May 1980. Paratroopers carried out 3 days of barbarity with the zeal of Nazi stormtroopers, unquote, as Asia Watch investigative mission reported. Quote, beating, stabbing, and mutilating unarmed civilians, including children, young girls, and aged grandmothers, unquote. 2,000 people were killed in this rampage, they estimate. The U.S. received 2 requests for assistance. The Citizens Committee that had called for democracy requested help in negotiations. General Chun requested the release of 20,000 troops under U.S. command to join the stormtroopers. The latter request was honored. The U.S. naval and air units were deployed in a further show of U.S. support. Koreans who had expected help from Carter were dumbfounded, quote unquote. Tim Sharrock writes, as, quote, the news of direct support from the U.S. was broadcast to the people of Gwangju from helicopters and proclaimed throughout the nation in blazing newspaper headlines, unquote. A few days later, Carter sent the head of the Export-Import Bank to Seoul to assure the military junta of U.S. economic support, approving a $600 million loan. As Chun took over the presidency by force, Carter said that while we would prefer democracy, quote, the Koreans are not ready for that. According to their own judgment, I don't know how to explain it any better, unquote. Chun arrested thousands of subversives calling for democracy, sending them to military-run purification camps, that's in quotes. Hundreds of labor leaders were purged. New legislation severely weakened unions, leading to a 30% drop in membership. censorship became even more harsh. Gratified with this progress, the Reagan administration honored Chung by selecting him as the first head of state to visit after the inauguration. Visiting Korea in 1986, Secretary of State George Shultz praised the terrific job being done in security and in the economy and the, quote, impressive movement towards democracy. He expressed his strong support for General Chun. He harshly criticized the Democratic opposition, refusing to meet with its leaders Kim Dae-jung and Kim Yong-sam, and explaining that, quote, how countries design things can vary and you can still call it democracy, unquote.
Okay, Barbara.
And at least in various schools, various different places. And originally published in the late 30s and rediscovered about later by Alice Walker. And I think the fact that it was sort of missed for many years and then rediscovered or discovered probably for the first time says something also not only about book banning but about books by women and particularly African American women. I'm going to read three paragraphs, I think, and it's from a early on in the book. There's a those of you who've read it probably remember that there's a it's an image also used as a symbol of a pear tree and related to sexuality. And I chose one of the earlier passages that talks about this. It was a spring afternoon in West Florida. Janie had spent most of the day under a blossoming pear tree in the backyard. She had been spending every minute that she could steal from her chores under that tree for the last 3 days. That was to say, ever since the first tiny bloom had opened. It had called her to come and gaze on a mystery, from barren brown stems to glistening leaf buds, from the leaf buds to snowy virginity of bloom. It stirred her tremendously. How? Why? It was like a flute song forgotten in another existence and remembered again. What? How? Why? The singing she heard that had nothing to do with her ears. The rose of the world was breathing out smell. It followed her through all her waking moments and caressed her in her sleep. It connected itself with other vaguely felt matters that had struck her outside observation and buried themselves in her flesh. Now they emerged and quested about her consciousness. She was stretched on her back beneath the pear tree, soaking in the alto chant of the visiting bees, the gold of the sun and the panting breath of the breeze when the inaudible voice of it all came to her. She saw a dust-bearing bee sink into the sanctum of a bloom, the thousand sister calyxes arched to meet the love embrace, and the ecstatic shiver of the tree from root to tiniest branch, creaming in every blossom and frothing with delight. So this was a marriage? She had been summoned to behold a revelation. Then Janie felt a pain remorseless sweet that left her limp and languid. Vision, and everywhere she found and acknowledged answers. A personal answer for all other creatures except herself. She felt an answer seeking her, but where? When? How? She found herself at the kitchen door and stumbled inside. In the air of the room were flies tumbling and singing, marrying and giving in marriage. When she reached the narrow hallway, she was reminded that her grandmother was home with a sick headache. She was lying across the bed asleep, so Janie tipped on out of the front door. Oh, to be a pear tree, any tree in bloom. With kissing bees singing of the beginning of the world. She was 16. She had glossy leaves and bursting buds, and she wanted to struggle with life, but it seemed to elude her. Where were the singing bees for her? Nothing on the place nor in her grandma's house answered her. She could from the top of the front steps, and then went on down to the front gate and leaned over to gaze up and down the road, looking, waiting, breathing short with impatience, waiting for the world to be made.
excessive sexual content and standing as a corrupting influence for youth, and removed school readings and banned from libraries in the county. In Seattle, ironically, and for a completely opposite reason, there's an argument to ban completely for racial insensitivity in its portrayal of Native Americans. It indeed appears that there are few camps, if any, that Brave New World does not offend. Will be the last section of the book, beginning in the middle of and up through the end, and the after scene of a massive orgy in which one of the two protagonists, the Savage, finally succumbs to the corruption of the world state. Oh, the flesh, the Savage ground his teeth. This time it was on his shoulders that the whip descended. Kill it, kill it. Drawn by the fascination of the horror of pain, and from within, impelled by that habit of cooperation, that desire for unanimity, the atonement which their conditioning had so ineradicably implanted in them, they began to mime the frenzy of his gestures, striking at one another as the Savage struck at his own rebellious flesh, or at the plump incarnation of turpitude writhing in the heather at his feet. Kill it, kill it, kill it, the Savage went on shouting. Then suddenly someone started singing Orgy Porgy, and in a moment they had all caught up the refrain and singing had begun to dance. Orgy Porgy, round and round, beating one another in 6/8 time, Orgy Porgy. It was after midnight when the last of the helicopters took its flight. Stupefied by soma and exhausted by a long-drawn frenzy of sensuality, the Savage lay sleeping in the heather. The sun was already high when he awoke. He lay for a moment, blinking in owlish incomprehension at the light, then suddenly remembered everything. Oh, my God, he covered his eyes with his hand. That evening, the swarm of helicopters that came buzzing across the Hog's Back was a dark cloud 10 kilometers long. The description of last night's orgy of atonement had been in all the papers. Savage, called the first arrivals as they alighted from their machine. Mr. Savage! There was no answer. The door in the lighthouse was ajar. They pushed it open and walked into a shuttered twilight. Through an archway on the further side of the room, they could see the bottom of the staircase that led up to the higher floors. Just under the crown of the arch dangled a pair of feet. Mr. Savage! Slowly, very slowly, like two unhurried compass needles, the feet turned towards the right. North, northeast, east, southeast, south, south-southwest, then paused, and after a few seconds turned as unhurriedly back towards the left. South-southwest, south, southeast, east.
Okay, Martin.
I'm going to be reading from the novel The Turner Diaries, which is currently banned in both Canada and Germany. A little bit of introduction. It's been described by the FBI as the Bible of the racist right, and it's basically just a white supremacist wet dream. It's about a band of white supremacist terrorists in the United States who slowly but surely take over the planet, and you can assume what happens from there. Oftentimes, when books are banned, they're banned because they're said to inspire, sexual aberration or, being anti-family, as the last book was cited as being. And there's always much debate as to whether or not, book X does inspire drug use. The Turner Diaries can't really have that debate because many people have committed incredibly violent crimes and have openly admitted to being very much inspired by the Turner Diaries. The most famous of which is probably the Oklahoma City bombing, which when the guy who did it was arrested, they found a copy of the Turner Diaries in his truck. Numerous terrorist organizations have been founded and the names of the groups have come from the Turner Diaries. Yet it remains incredibly popular. Between 1978 and 2000, it sold over 500,000 copies, and it's available on the internet, which is where I found it, all over the place. It's been translated into dozens of different languages. You can even buy it on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. You can see the user reviews on it and find some very interesting opinions. And as to why I'm reading it, I find a Larry Flint's quote most appropriate, which is that freedom of speech doesn't protect speech you like. It protects speech you don't like. And I think when we celebrate don't celebrate but commemorate the banning of books, it's important for us to read from books that we find insanely offensive. Otherwise, it's just sort of self-congratulatory of like, oh, who could ban Harry Potter? Who would think of doing that? They're so ignorant. So I think we should read from things that we absolutely hate. So without further ado, if anybody wants to leave, that's perfectly understandable. Liberalism is an essentially feminine, submissive worldview. Perhaps a better adjective than feminine is infantile. It is the worldview of men who do not have the moral toughness, the spiritual strength, to stand up and do single combat with life, who cannot adjust to the reality that the world is not a huge pink and blue padded nursery in which the lions lie down with the lambs and everyone lives happily ever after. Nor should spiritually healthy men of our race even want the world to be like that, if it could be so. That is an alien, essentially oriental approach to life, the worldview of slaves rather than of free men of the West. But it has permeated our whole society. Even those who do not consciously accept the liberal doctrines have been corrupted by them. Decade after decade, the race problem in America has become worse. But the majority of those who wanted a solution, who wanted to preserve a white America, were never able to screw up the courage to look the obvious solutions in the face. All the liberals and the Jews had to do was to begin screeching about inhumanity or injustice or genocide. And most of our people who had been beating around the edge of a solution took to their heels like frightened rabbits. Because there was never a way to solve the race problem which would be fair to everybody, or which everyone concerned could be politely persuaded into accepting without any fuss or unpleasantness, they kept trying to evade it, hoping that it would go away by itself. And the same has been true of the Jewish problem, and the immigration problem, and the overpopulation problem, and the eugenics problem, and 1,000 related problems. Yes, the inability to face reality and make difficult decisions. That is the salient symptom of the liberal disease, always trying to avoid a minor unpleasantness now, so that a major unpleasantness becomes unavoidable later, always evading any responsibility to the future. That is the way the liberal mind works.
Why don't we hear from J.K. Rowling? You knew it was coming.
Sort of a little bit of background on this. Harry Potter, as I think most of us know, was banned because it has witchcraft in it, and a lot of people had a problem with that. Another reason I saw that it was challenged, at least, was because it had youthful misbehavior, something like that. Now, I did my research paper last year on censorship of young adult literature, and I think it's interesting that children's literature is probably some of the most challenged. Often, books are pulled from curriculums, as we've heard, and libraries where children or young people would have access to them. And so I think it is important to read things like Harry Potter.
I'm so sorry.
It's totally okay. I understand what you're saying. But I think it is important to read things like this because it is what we're giving to our children, and I think that it's important to see why people would want to challenge those. Snape's uneven yellowish teeth were bared. "Turn out your pockets, Potter," he spat suddenly. Harry didn't move. There was a pounding in his ears. "Turn out your pockets, or we go straight to the headmaster. Pull them out, Potter." Cold with dread, Harry slowly pulled out the bag of Zonko's tricks and the Marauder's map. Snape picked up the Zonko's bag. "Ron gave them to me," said Harry, praying he'd get a chance to tip Ron off before Snape saw him. "He brought them back from Hogsmeade last time." "Indeed. And you've been carrying them around ever since. How very touching. And what is this?" Snape had picked up the map. Harry tried with all his might to keep his face impassive. "Spare bit of parchment," he shrugged. Snape turned it over, his eyes on Harry. "Surely you don't need such a very old piece of parchment," he said. "Why don't I just throw this away?" His hand moved towards the fire. "No!" Harry said quickly. "So," said Snape, his long nostrils quivering, "is this another treasured gift from Mr. Weasley, or is it something else? A letter, perhaps, written in invisible ink? Or instructions to get into Hogsmeade without passing the Dementors?" Harry blinked. Snape's eyes gleamed. Let me see," he muttered, taking out his wand and smoothing the map out on his desk. "Reveal your secret," he said, touching the wand to the parchment. Nothing happened. Harry clenched his hands to stop them shaking. "Show yourself," Snape said, tapping the map sharply. It stayed blank. Harry was taking deep, calming breaths. Professor Severus Snape, master of this school, commands you to yield the information you conceal, Snape said, hitting the map with his wand. As though an invisible hand was writing upon it, words appeared on the smooth surface of the map. Mr. Moody presents his compliments to Professor Snape and begs him to keep his abnormally large nose out of other people's business. Snape froze. Harry stared, dumbstruck, at the message, but the map didn't stop there. More writing was appearing beneath the first. Mr. Prongs agrees with Mr. Mooney and would like to add that Professor Snape is an ugly git. It would have been very funny if the situation hadn't been so serious, and there was more. Mr. Padfoot would like to register his astonishment that an idiot like that ever became a professor. Harry closed his eyes in horror. When he'd opened them, the map had had its last word. Mr. Wormtail bids Professor Snape good day and advises him to wash his hair, the slime ball. Harry waited for the blow to fall. So, said Snape softly, we'll see about this. He strode across to the fire, seized a fistful of glittering powder from a jar on the fireplace, and threw it into the flames. Lupin! Snape called into the fire. I want a word.